She pretended to be her sister. But when the blind fiancé saw her face, nothing was the same again. She was never supposed to wear the white dress. Her sister was. But when Amara Whitmore was forced to marry her sister's blind millionaire fiancé, the lie was only meant to last a day. One signature, one kiss, and she'd disappear. But Grant Beaumont wasn't just any man. He couldn't see her face, yet he sensed every truth she tried to hide. What happens when a man who lives in darkness begins to see her more clearly than anyone ever has? And when his sight returns, will love remain, or will the truth destroy everything? Stay to the end. This story will break and heal you. Before we begin the story, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. And subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our latest stories. Enjoy the story. The wedding bells were not supposed to ring for her. Amara Whitmore stood in the dressing room of the famed St. Augustine Cathedral in Charleston, South Carolina, trembling as the final pins were thrust into her hair. She wasn't the bride. She was never supposed to be. But the name stitched inside the delicate lace gown read hers, not Juliet's, not the golden girl everyone adored. Hers. The air smelled of white orchids and sweat. Outside the tall, stained glass windows, media vans were parked along the sidewalk, buzzing with excitement. Photographers waited to snap pictures of the social event of the season, the union of Grant Beaumont, a mysterious blind tech billionaire, and Juliet Whitmore, the dazzling face of the Whitmore legacy. But no one knew Juliet had run. She'd vanished the night before with a single note scrawled in gold ink. "He's not my type. Fix it." And now, Amara was the one being shoved into silk and secrets. "You're the only one who can pull this off," her mother hissed, tightening the gown at her waist with shaking hands. "You've been answering his calls for months while Juliet was too busy gallivanting. He won't know. He can't see." Amara's voice faltered. "This is insane. This is fraud. This is survival," Margot snapped, eyes glinting like polished steel. "Do you want to see our name dragged through the mud? Do you want him to cancel every investment, every partnership, every cent he's brought into our family?" "But he'll know," Amara whispered. "He'll feel it. He'll hear it." Margot's fingers clutched her arm. "You've played her voice for 6 months. You've memorized her laugh, her lines, her lies. Today, you'll become her. Just for the ceremony. Just for a day. And then we'll clean this mess quietly." The door burst open, and the wedding coordinator's voice pierced the tension. "Miss Whitmore, it's time." No one asked if she was ready. No one asked if she could do it. They simply led her to the aisle and pulled back the velvet curtain. And there, beneath the cathedral's golden arches, waited the man she'd never seen, but had spoken to every night under a false name. Grant Beaumont stood tall in a tailored black tuxedo, his hands folded calmly in front of him. He was blind, yes, but not unknowing. His face was unreadable, but his body radiated something Amara hadn't expected: alertness, awareness, as if he were listening for something far deeper than music. She took one shaky step forward, then another. The whispers in the pews were deafening. The violinist played a song so beautiful it felt cruel, and Amara's hands refused to stop trembling. As she reached the altar, Grant turned his face toward her, not to see her, but to feel her presence. "Why are you shaking?" he asked softly, just above a whisper. "Are you afraid I'll recognize you?" Amara froze. He didn't say, see. He said, recognize. The officiant began speaking, but her pulse roared louder than any word. Her mouth went dry. Her mother's warning echoed in her head. Say nothing. Do nothing. Just smile and nod. So when the question came, do you, Juliet Whitmore, take Grant Beaumont to be your lawfully wedded husband? Amara forced the lie from her lips. I do. A slight pause. And then, with an expression that betrayed nothing, Grant reached out and took her hand. His touch was firm, but strangely gentle. Too gentle. As if he already knew it didn't belong to the woman he'd thought he'd marry. And yet, he said nothing. When they walked out of the church to a storm of flashbulbs and rose petals, the city believed they had witnessed a love story. But behind the tinted windows of the limousine, Amara sat beside a man she had lied to for months, a man who had never seen her face but had once told her, over a late-night call, that some truths are best heard, not seen. Now, married to him, in a lie that could destroy them both, Amara faced the question she couldn't outrun. What happens when the man who can't see you knows exactly who you are? And more terrifyingly, what if he falls in love with the wrong woman? The only way to find out is to stay with us. Because this story, it's only just beginning. If you're as breathless as Amara right now, hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with someone who needs a gripping, emotional escape today. Stay tuned for part 2. You won't want to miss what comes next. The drive to the Beaumont estate felt like a lifetime wrapped in velvet silence. Amara sat with her hands tightly clasped in her lap, the lace of her gown biting into her skin. She could feel Grant's presence beside her. Calm, composed, unreadable. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But somehow she felt watched. Not with eyes, but with something sharper. Something that listened for hesitation and tasted every unspoken breath. The car glided through winding roads, and the world outside blurred into a dark watercolor of trees and streetlights. She had heard about the estate in whispers. Secluded, regal, unlike anything else in Charleston. A fortress, they said, a kingdom. And tonight, it would become her prison. When the gates swung open and the car pulled up to the front entrance, Amara's breath caught. The house loomed in quiet grandeur, all stone and steel, and tall glass windows that reflected nothing but the night. The staff stood in a silent row, trained smiles etched across their faces. They greeted her as Mrs. Beaumont. She barely nodded. Inside, the air was cool and still, like a museum that had forgotten how to live. A butler led her to a long corridor lined with abstract paintings, while Grant followed closely behind, cane tapping lightly against the floor. At the end of the hall, double doors opened to a suite lit by soft golden light. One room, one bed, one truth waiting to explode. You can rest here, Grant said, his voice low but kind. You've had a long day. Amara turned, startled by how close he was now. His face was angled toward her, blind eyes unblinking, but his expression held something unnameable. She felt her heart flutter wildly, unsure if it was fear or something else. Thank you, she murmured. He tilted his head. You sound different. Panic seized her throat. It's just the nerves. Everything happened so fast. There was a beat of silence. I imagine it did, he said softly, as though testing her with every syllable. You didn't think it would go this far, did you? Amara blinked. What do you mean? Grant smiled. But it wasn't cruel. It was quiet, patient, and laced with something she didn't yet understand. Most people don't get married by accident. But then again, most people don't answer the phone under someone else's name either. The words struck her like thunder. She stepped back involuntarily, but he didn't move forward. He simply stood there, serene, as if revealing a truth he'd been waiting to say out loud. "You knew?" she whispered. "I suspected," he replied. "I've suspected for a while." Her heart pounded in her ears. Then why go through with it? Grant took a step closer. Not threatening, not commanding, but deliberate. "Because I wanted to know who you were when no one was watching. I wanted to see if the woman behind the lie could still be real." Amara's throat tightened. "I never meant to hurt you. I was never supposed to be part of this." "I believe you," he said. "But believing doesn't mean forgetting." A moment passed between them, long, stretched thin with truth. "I'll sleep in the guest room," he added. "You need space, and I need clarity." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the golden light, surrounded by a silence she had never known could feel so intimate. That night, Amara sat by the window, the moonlight painting pale shadows across the floor. She no longer felt like a thief in someone else's life. She felt like someone who had been given a key to a locked heart and now didn't know if she had the courage to open it. She had expected judgment, rejection, fury, but Grant had offered none of those. Instead, he'd offered her the one thing she wasn't prepared for: a second chance to be seen, even in the dark. And that terrified her more than anything, because now the lie wasn't just about survival. It had become a choice to keep hiding or finally step into the light. And somehow, she wasn't sure which scared her more. Stay tuned for part 3, where a secret room, a faded letter, and a memory Grant never told anyone about might just change everything. If this story is already pulling you in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The truth is only beginning to rise. The morning light crept in through the high arched windows of the Beaumont estate, quiet and golden, dust swirling in the beams like secret thoughts made visible. Amara hadn't slept. She hadn't even changed out of the gown. She sat on the edge of the bed, shoes kicked off hours ago, her fingers tugging at a loose thread on the sleeve. Every sound in the house seemed louder now. The ticking of a distant clock, the rustle of curtains as the wind tiptoed in. And then, Grant's footsteps. She heard him before she saw him. The soft tap of his cane, measured and deliberate. She thought he might pass the room entirely, continue down the hall, and vanish into the quiet sanctuary of his study. But then the tapping paused, and then a knock. 3 gentle raps against the door. "I'm not here to pry," Grant said through the wood, "but there's coffee in the conservatory if you'd like to join me." Amara didn't answer right away. Part of her wanted to refuse, to hide beneath the sheets and pretend this marriage, this lie, had already unraveled. But another part of her, the part that had never had a choice, wondered what would happen if, for once, she said yes. Minutes later, she entered the conservatory barefoot. Her gown exchanged for a simple white blouse and soft beige trousers that weren't hers but fit well enough. The conservatory was flooded with light and green, ferns climbing up the walls, orchids suspended in midair, morning glories curling toward the sky. And in the center, Grant sat with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, his head tilted ever so slightly toward the sun. "You came," he said without looking. I wasn't sure I should, she replied. He gestured toward the chair across from him. Neither was I. They sat in silence for a while, letting the birdsong and rustling leaves speak for them. Amara traced the rim of her coffee cup with her finger, her heart still pounding from the weight of last night's conversation. Why orchids? She asked suddenly, nodding toward the row of delicate white blooms near the window. They're resilient, Grant said. They don't bloom to impress. They bloom because they must. She smiled faintly. You talk about them like they're people. Some flowers are more honest than people, he murmured. They don't lie about who they are. Amara looked away. The guilt, once cold and sharp, now settled like a dull ache behind her ribs. You could have exposed me last night. Told everyone. Sent me back. I could have, he agreed, sipping his coffee. But I didn't. Why? Grant didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He set it on the table between them. She hesitated before unfolding it. It was a letter. The ink faded, the handwriting delicate and looping. She recognized it immediately. It was her own, from a time when she thought no one would ever read her words. A letter she had written months ago, but never sent, tucked inside a book left in the study. Dear Grant, it began. I'm sorry you don't know who I am. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to tell the truth. But if you could see me, not with your eyes, but with whatever it is inside you that hears everything, I hope you'd forgive the girl who only ever wanted to be heard. Amara covered her mouth, tears stinging her eyes. How did you find this? I didn't, he said quietly. You left it for me. No, you didn't mean to, maybe, but you did. She looked at him, really looked. And for the first time, Grant met her gaze with such calmness that it made her ache. I may be blind, Amara, he said, her name falling softly from his lips. But I have seen more of you than anyone else ever has. The air between them shifted, like something old and bruised had been given permission to breathe. I don't deserve your kindness, she whispered. No, Grant said. You deserve better than the burden you've been carrying. The words broke something inside her. Not the fragile mask she wore, but the walls beneath it. The ones she'd built long before this marriage, long before she ever said, I do, under someone else's name. They didn't speak again that morning. But when Amara left the conservatory, the silence between them had changed. It wasn't avoidance anymore. It was a space held open, tender, tentative, and waiting to be filled. Later that afternoon, she found herself alone in the library. Not by chance, but because something in her needed to see it again. The place where her letter had lived. The room where his past lingered in every dusty book and untouched page. She wandered through the shelves until she found a photo album buried under a stack of unread journals. The cover was worn, the pages crisp. Inside were black and white images of a younger Grant, eyes still sighted, face full of quiet wonder. But the last photo was what caught her breath. It was a picture of a woman with eyes like fire and a mouth set in a proud, fierce line. At the bottom, a single line was written in Grant's hand. She taught me how to love and how to grieve, and I did both, blindly. Amara closed the album, her fingers trembling. This man, this stranger she'd been pretending to love, had lived more lost than most would ever know. And yet, he'd sat across from her this morning with nothing but patience and grace. She pressed the album to her chest and whispered a vow only the walls would hear. I will not lie to him again. No matter what happened next, no matter how the truth eventually unraveled, Amara had made her choice. She would stay, not because she had to, but because, somehow, she wanted to. And somewhere in the corners of the estate, Grant smiled to himself as if he had heard her vow, because perhaps he had. The next few days passed like breath held too long, silent, stretched, suspended. The Beaumont estate, with its winding marble halls and gardens blooming out of season, began to feel less like a fortress and more like a liminal space, where something old was unraveling and something fragile was taking root. Amara found herself waking before the sun, not out of obligation, but out of a restless need to move, to serve, to anchor herself in something real. She would brew tea just the way Grant liked it. Loose leaf, steeped exactly 4 minutes, no sugar. She left it outside his study without a note. No declarations, no performance, only a gesture. Grant never commented, but each day the cup was empty by noon. On the 5th morning, he joined her in the solarium, where she was watering the succulents. She didn't hear him come in, only noticed his presence when she turned and found him leaning against the glass doorframe. "Are you afraid of silence?" he asked. She blinked, unsure of how to answer. "Sometimes, but lately, not as much." He stepped closer. His movements were careful, practiced, not cautious, because he couldn't see, but because he didn't want to startle her. "Silence used to be the only thing that listened to me. Then I met you." She looked down at her hands, dirt under her fingernails, her heart suddenly fragile in her chest. "I'm not the woman you think I am, Grant." His brows lifted slightly. "You say that like it's a confession." "It is." He tilted his head toward the light. "Then tell me who you are." Amara hesitated. The truth swelled in her throat, demanding to be spoken. But fear had a cruel grip. And love, if that was what this flicker in her chest had become, made liars out of the purest hearts. "I'm just someone who thought she could make things right by pretending to be someone else," she whispered. "And now I don't know how to be real." There was a pause. She braced herself for the shift, for the coldness, for the familiar withdrawal. But instead, Grant exhaled softly and said, "Then let's be real from here." He extended his hand. She stared at it, startled, not by the gesture, but by how badly she wanted to take it. Not out of pity or guilt, but need. And so she did. Their fingers touched like two threads, finally sewn together after being pulled apart for too long. That afternoon, they ventured beyond the house for the first time. Grant asked her to take him to the east orchard, where the apple trees bloomed early and the old barn stood half collapsed from a storm 10 years ago. No guests ever came here, no eyes, no cameras, no expectations. She guided him down the path, her voice soft, describing the changing textures underfoot: gravel, grass, roots. She told him about the color of the sky, a milky gray stretched thin like cotton, about the way the light filtered through the trees in slants, almost holy. Grant listened, nodding slowly. "You see the world like someone who's afraid it might disappear." "Maybe because I've never had anything stay," she replied. They reached the barn and sat on the old wooden steps. The air was thick with damp earth and old wood, the scent of spring beginning to rise from the soil. "You know," he said after a long silence, "when I lost my sight, people started treating me like I was less, like I should be pitied. But blindness was never what broke me." "What was it then?" she asked. "Being lied to. being handled. Everyone around me pretending things were fine, talking in voices too sweet, too careful. I could hear it in every word, the weight of what they weren't saying. Amara closed her eyes. That's what I've done, haven't I? Grant turned his face toward her, though his eyes didn't meet hers. Yes, but you also made the silence bearable again. They didn't speak after that, but something had shifted, something more than understanding. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a door opening, just enough for the light to slip through. Later that night, Amara stood at the window of the guest room that was still technically hers, watching the rain slick down the glass like threads of silver. She wondered what Celeste was doing at that very moment, if she even cared that her fiancé had married someone else in her place, if she regretted vanishing, or if she'd always expected Amara to clean up her mess. But strangely, she didn't feel hatred. She just felt free. For the first time in her life, she was no longer the shadow in someone else's story. She was the one writing this chapter, even if it began with a lie. And even if it would someday end in heartbreak, it would still be hers. As she turned from the window, her gaze fell to the bedside table, where Grant had left something that morning. A book, not a grand romantic gesture, just a simple paperback. Inside the cover, a single note scribbled in clean, deliberate handwriting. You said you didn't know how to be real, but the way you hold silence, that's the most honest thing I've ever heard. She pressed the book to her chest and let herself cry. Not because she was afraid, but because she wasn't. And outside, the rain softened. The house exhaled. And somewhere down the hall, a man who couldn't see had already begun to sense the shift. He didn't need his eyes to know. She was choosing to stay. The next morning began with a silence that felt different. Not heavy or fearful, but patient, like something waiting to bloom. Amara moved through the estate with quiet purpose. Every room she passed through felt a little less like a stage and a little more like part of her world. She had spent weeks trying to avoid attention, keeping her footsteps soft, her voice softer. But now, she wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't pretending to be Celeste. She was simply Amara. Grant sat in the library when she entered, his back straight in a chair by the window. He had a habit of facing the light, even if he couldn't see it. She found it poetic. She placed a fresh cup of tea beside him. He turned his head slightly. Earl Grey? Lemon ginger, she corrected gently. He nodded. Better. Celeste hated ginger. Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. I'm not her, Grant. I know. There was a long pause, filled with unsaid things. I think I knew the moment you touched my hand on our wedding day, he continued. Celeste's touch was polished. Yours was unsure, but kind. I was scared, she admitted. You still are. Yes. He reached out and found her hand across the table. He didn't hold it, just rested his fingers lightly against hers. That's why I trust you more. Amara looked at him, startled. Why would fear make me trustworthy? Because people who are scared of breaking something tend to handle it with care. It was such a simple line, but it unraveled something deep inside her. Later that afternoon, they returned to the orchard. The ground was still damp from yesterday's rain, and the scent of new blossoms lingered in the air. Amara walked beside him, her voice painting vivid scenes. The dandelions pushing through gravel, the bluebirds dipping into puddles, the golden sunlight streaming between bare tree branches. She didn't try to sound poetic. She didn't try to impress him. She just described what she saw. But what she didn't know was that he wasn't listening for the imagery. He was listening to her, to how her breath caught when the wind stirred the trees, to the smile she tried to hide in her voice, to the warmth she couldn't fake, even if she tried. When they reached the bench by the far fence, Grant sat down slowly, turning his face toward the sun. "Tell me something you've never told anyone." Amara hesitated. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The truth had lived behind a wall for so long, she wasn't sure it could come out without shaking the whole world. But Grant didn't push. He waited. So she said it. "When I was 13, I used to write letters to myself and hide them in the back of a photo album. I thought, if I didn't survive this family, at least some version of me would." Grant didn't react right away. Then quietly, "Did any of those letters say you'd end up here?" "No," she whispered. "Not even close." A small smile touched his lips. "I think that version of you would be proud." Amara laughed under her breath, the sound sharp with emotion. "She'd probably cry. Then punch me for being so stupid." "You're not stupid." "No," she agreed softly, just finally awake. The wind picked up. A petal blew past them, brushing her cheek like a fleeting promise. "Do you want to leave, eh?" he asked suddenly. She blinked. "What?" "This house, this marriage, this mistake. If you walk out now, no one will stop you." Amara looked at him, heart hammering. "Is that what you want?" He turned toward her slowly. "No." Her breath trembled. "But I won't hold you here if it is." She stared down at her hands in her lap, torn open by the simplicity of his words. "I don't want to leave," she said finally. "Not because I'm trapped, but because I finally have something to stay for." The truth was bare now, stripped of shame. And for the first time since this began, the air between them was clean. That night, she found a note tucked under her bedroom door. "Tomorrow, let's walk without words. Let's see what silence says." No signature, no initials, just that quiet invitation. Amara folded it and held it to her chest. For the first time, silence didn't feel like something she had to fear. It felt like something that could carry love. Morning arrived, dressed in silver light. The sky was still, as if even the wind didn't want to interrupt the quiet. Amara stood at the threshold of the garden path, coat in hand. The note from last night tucked in her pocket like a secret between souls. Grant was already waiting by the hedge, one hand resting lightly on the stone pillar that marked the start of the trail. He didn't greet her with words. She didn't expect him to. Side by side, they began to walk, letting the rhythm of their footsteps speak what their mouths could not. The gravel crunched softly beneath their shoes. Birds chirped somewhere in the trees, and the scent of wet earth rose around them like memory. Amara didn't describe the scenery this time. She didn't have to. Grant knew this path too well, and today wasn't about sight. Today was about presence. They reached a bend in the trail, where a small stone bench overlooked a clearing. Without a word, they sat. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was full, rich, like it had ripened over time. After a few moments, Grant finally spoke. "When I first lost my sight, everyone around me stopped talking honestly. They didn't describe pain, only beauty. They'd say sunset, but never mention shadows. Rain, but never thunder." Amara glanced at him, unsure of what to say. "I started to think I was being protected, or lied to." She lowered her gaze. "Which was worse, being protected?" he said without hesitation. "Because at least a lie admits it's hiding something. Protection just assumes you're too weak to know the truth." Amara exhaled slowly, her breath catching in her throat. I guess that's why I noticed you, Grant continued. You didn't pretend things were perfect. Even your silences were honest. Her hands tightened in her lap. Maybe because I didn't know how to be anyone else anymore. He turned his face toward her, eyes open though unfocused. I think the real you was always louder than your disguise. I just had to listen harder. Amara blinked against the warmth that gathered in her chest. I'm sorry I lied. I know, he said softly. But I also know it was never for the reasons they think. A beat passed. I remember the first time I heard your voice. It was late. You were on the phone, pretending to be someone else. But your laugh, it cracked. You tried to catch it, smooth it over. But I heard it. Amara laughed now, almost involuntarily. You noticed a crack? I noticed the truth leaking through. There was a pause. Then he asked a question that broke something wide open. Have you ever been loved without conditions, Amara? Her breath hitched. No, she said quietly. Not once. Grant nodded slowly. Then maybe it's time. She looked up, startled. Time for what? For you to stop apologizing for existing. A breeze stirred the leaves above them, scattering petals like confetti. Amara reached for them instinctively, one brushing her fingertips before drifting away. I don't know how to stop being sorry, she whispered. Then let me show you, Grant said. Day by day. Not as your reward, not as your penance, but as your partner. Her eyes stung. She didn't cry, but her heart swelled to the point of breaking. That evening, back at the estate, she stood in front of the mirror, not to fix her hair or perfect her posture, but to finally look at herself without flinching. This woman wasn't flawless. She wasn't the one picked first. She wasn't chosen by ambition or calculation, but she was enough. Later, she found herself walking past the west wing of the house, drawn by the sound of piano keys. She paused at the door. Grant was sitting alone at the grand piano, his fingers dancing across the keys. It wasn't a song she recognized, but she knew, deep down, it was written for her. She stepped inside, quietly, not to disturb. He didn't stop playing, but his voice drifted over the melody. Every note I played before you was noise. This is music. Amara felt something in her chest collapse and rebuild all at once. She crossed the room slowly, barefoot, drawn toward the melody like a moth to light. And for the first time, she didn't hesitate to stand beside him, not as a shadow, not as a substitute, but as herself, as Amara, as someone who had not been chosen by fate, but who had been seen. The days that followed felt like waking from a long winter. Not all at once, not in sudden bloom, but in slow, careful thawing. Amara had stopped pretending. Grant had stopped questioning, but neither of them had named what was growing between them. It pulsed silently in shared spaces, in the tea she brought him without asking, in the books she read aloud, her voice no longer trembling. But silence, even when comforting, holds its own kind of danger, especially when others are waiting in the wings to break it. It happened on a Sunday. Amara was in the conservatory, tending to the orchids she'd revived from near death. Grant was seated nearby, his hands lightly brushing a Braille manuscript he hadn't touched in years. She'd told him they needed more light, these flowers, more time to breathe. He'd said he understood, that perhaps they weren't the only things learning how to grow. Then came the sound, heels, sharp, deliberate. A scent, too strong, too calculated. The distinct sound of superiority cloaked in silk. Amara turned first, fingers tightening around the watering can. Grant merely lifted his head. Standing at the threshold was Sienna, impeccably dressed, expression unreadable. She stepped into the room like she had never left it. Her eyes went straight to Grant, but her words were for Amara. "So this is where you've been hiding." Amara's breath caught. Grant's hand stilled over the braille. Sienna crossed the room slowly, surveying the orchids with a disinterested glance before turning her gaze on Grant. "I was told you've recovered more than expected, that your condition is improving." Grant's voice was calm, but it cut through the tension like a wire. "I can see shadows now, shapes, not fully, not clearly." "And yet," Sienna murmured, eyes flicking to Amara, "you've made some very interesting choices." Amara stepped forward instinctively. "What are you doing here?" Sienna smiled, a practiced gesture honed for cameras and courtrooms. "You didn't think I'd let my fiancé disappear forever, did you?" Grant stood slowly, his frame steady. "You were never really here to begin with." "Harsh," she replied, her voice as smooth as glass, but not untrue. Amara turned toward Grant, confusion knitting her brow. "She knew," he said quietly. "Long before the accident, she had one foot out the door. I was just the wrong kind of burden." Sienna didn't flinch. "I was the reality check you needed. You were too romantic, too eager to believe in things that didn't exist." "Like love?" Grant asked, tilting his head slightly. "Or loyalty?" Sienna gave a slow shrug. "You've replaced me clearly, with a girl who doesn't even know who she is." "That's where you're wrong," Amara said, her voice rising, not in volume, but in resolve. "I've spent my whole life not knowing. But with him, I found pieces I didn't know were mine." Sienna stepped closer. "You think this will last? That he won't resent you once he sees everything clearly? The lies, the impersonation, the pathetic need to be someone else." Grant moved to stand beside Amara. "She's not someone else. She's Amara, and she's the only one who ever stayed." The words stunned even Amara. She felt them land not just in the air, but in her bones. Sienna scoffed. "How poetic. A blind man falling for the fraud." "No," Grant said, eyes unwavering though dimmed by shadows. "A man finally seeing what matters." There was nothing more to say. Sienna turned, her heels echoing down the hallway like the last breath of a storm. But her exit didn't bring peace. It left the truth exposed, raw, trembling like a wire strung too tight. Amara stood still, unsure whether to cry or collapse. Grant reached for her hand, grounding them both. "She'll try again," she whispered. "Let her," he replied. "This time I'm not blind." In that moment, Amara realized that love, real love, wasn't about the absence of lies. It was about what endured after the truth arrived. And it was arriving now, fast, loud, unavoidable. But for the first time in her life, she didn't want to run. She wanted to stay. The days after Sienna's visit passed like the slow pull of a tide, constant, undeniable, but no longer destructive. Something had shifted. Grant didn't speak of her again, but her presence lingered like a shadow in the corners of the Drake estate. Amara, however, refused to let that shadow define her. She began waking earlier, tending the orchids with new precision. She read in the afternoons, not because it was expected, but because she enjoyed hearing her voice mingle with Grant's soft breathing. He didn't ask questions anymore. He simply listened, sometimes with a faint smile, sometimes with stillness so complete It felt sacred. Then one morning, he surprised her. "I have something to show you," he said, voice low, but firm. He was sitting at the breakfast table, his fingers tracing the edge of a glass. Amara paused. "Show me." Grant rose. "I made an appointment at the hospital." Her heart stopped. "The doctors believe there's a chance," he continued, "that I could recover partial sight, enough to see outlines, light, maybe more." Amara didn't move. "That's good," she said softly, but her hands trembled. "I want to try," Grant said, "but I need to know something before I do." She looked up, heart pounding. "Why did you stay?" he asked. "Even after knowing I might see the truth one day?" Amara swallowed hard. The silence between them had always been gentle, but now it pressed against her like a question she wasn't ready to answer. "Because you were the only person who ever saw me before I knew who I was," she said. "And I was afraid that if you saw me now, with your eyes, I might lose that." Grant stepped closer. His eyes, still clouded, were locked in her direction. "Then let me say this while I'm still in the dark," he whispered. "You are not a lie. You were never a mistake. What we built, however it started, it's the truest thing I've ever known." Amara blinked back tears. "Will you come with me?" he asked. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Always, the hospital was quiet. Too quiet. Every footstep down the corridor echoed like a memory. Grant's hand gripped hers tightly, and she held it like a lifeline. The procedure was short, but the wait afterward felt endless. Amara sat beside his bed as the doctor gently removed the bandages. Her palms were sweaty, her heart an unsteady rhythm of dread and hope. The last gauze fell away. Grant blinked. Once, twice. A shaft of light poured through the window, hitting his face. He winced, but didn't turn away. Instead, he slowly opened his eyes. They were the same storm gray eyes she'd imagined so many times. But now they flickered with something more. Recognition. He looked at her, not through her, not past her, at her, and then he whispered her name. "Amara." No pretense, no confusion. She gasped. "You know, I've always known," he said, his voice barely above a breath. Not by sight, but by everything else. She reached for him, fingers trembling. "I'm sorry," she said, "for pretending, for not telling you, for all of it." He took her hand in his grip firm. "You didn't pretend to care. You didn't lie when you stayed up with me through nights I thought I wouldn't survive. You didn't fake the way you laughed at my worst jokes, or how you touched the piano when you thought I wasn't listening. That was all you." Amara wept quietly, the tears falling with no shame. "I don't know what happens next," she whispered. Grant smiled, a small, soft, real smile. "Then let's find out, together." That night, the house felt warmer than it ever had. The walls still held the silence they'd once filled with avoidance, but now it felt like space to breathe, to begin again. For the first time, they sat side by side under the stars, with nothing between them but the truth, and a love that had survived blindness, deception, and fear. And now, it was theirs to shape. The days that followed Grant's surgery felt like stepping into a new world. Not just for him, but for Amara too. Every morning, he woke with sunlight slipping through the blinds and the soft, hesitant realization that he could now make out shapes, shadows, and the silhouette of the woman who had once only been a voice in the dark. Amara no longer moved through the house like a ghost pretending to belong. Now she opened windows, let light in, played soft jazz on the record player she found buried in the basement. The Drake estate, once a silent museum of secrets and restraint, now exhaled with warmth, but still, a quiet fear clung to her ribs. He hadn't said the words she both longed for and dreaded. I forgive you. Instead, Grant had chosen to simply stay. He'd chosen her presence, her name, her truth. But what would happen when the world returned? When the facade of her sister's absence finally shattered under the weight of public expectation? One afternoon, while they were in the garden, Grant sat on the stone bench beneath the blooming dogwoods, sketching outlines of the landscape. He was learning to see in layers, shadow, motion, tone. Amara brought him a glass of lemonade, setting it gently beside his hand. Do you miss it? She asked quietly, brushing dirt from her palms. He didn't need clarification. The blindness, she nodded. Grant's gaze followed a bird flitting through the branches. Sometimes, he said, there was a certain honesty in not knowing what people looked like. You had to feel everything. Listen harder. Observe deeper. Amara sat beside him, quiet. But now, he continued, I get to do both. I see you, Amara. Not just with my eyes, with all of it. She bit her lip. And what do you see? Grant turned to her slowly. A woman who walked through fire without a name and still chose to love. A fragile smile crossed her face, but it faded when his phone buzzed. He checked it. His posture stiffened. It's from the board, he said. They want me at the annual gala next week. Amara felt her stomach sink. The gala, the same event where his engagement to Sienna had been announced publicly a year ago. She remembered the photographs, the headlines, the way her name had never once been mentioned. I don't have to go, he added quickly, sensing her hesitation. No, she said, straightening. You should. And so should I. Grant looked at her. Are you sure? No, she replied, her voice trembling. But I'm tired of hiding. You said you see me. If that's true, then I want the world to see me too. Not as a shadow, as your wife. The night of the gala arrived with nerves wrapped in silk. The Grand Meridian Hotel was bathed in gold light and chandeliers. High society moved like a current of glitter and practiced smiles. And at the top of the marble staircase, Grant stood in a sleek black tuxedo, waiting. Amara descended slowly, arm linked with his. Her gown was deep sapphire, simple but elegant, and unlike Sienna's polished persona, there was no heavy makeup, no designer statement, only authenticity, and a quiet glow that turned heads as she passed. Murmurs began. Was that Sienna? No. She looked familiar. Wasn't she? The questions swirled as they entered the ballroom. A board member raised his glass. Mr. Drake, it's good to have you back. And this must be... Grant didn't hesitate. He reached for Amara's hand and said, clear and certain, this is my wife, Amara Quinn. A hush fell. Eyes darted. One woman coughed awkwardly. But Grant's hand didn't waver, and Amara didn't look away. By the time dinner was served, the murmurs faded. Some smiled politely, others raised brows. But none of it mattered, because halfway through the evening, Grant leaned in and whispered against her temple, You're the bravest person I've ever known. And she whispered back, I'm only brave because you saw me, even when you couldn't. The cameras didn't capture the quiet squeeze of his hand, the way he looked at her like she was the center of his world. But Amara didn't need proof. She had his heart, and this time, no one could take it from her. It had been a year since the gala, and in that time, life for Amara and Grant had transformed in ways neither of them had expected. The world didn't stop spinning after their truth was revealed. There were headlines, of course. Scandals sell. Tabloids speculated about the other sister. Old photos of Sienna resurfaced with biting captions, and social media, ever hungry for drama, had their say. But beneath all the noise, something more powerful endured. Peace. Grant officially stepped away from the board 6 months after the gala. Not because he was pressured to, but because he realized he no longer needed the pedestal. What he needed was to build something honest from the ground up. And that's exactly what he and Amara did. Together, they opened a foundation in Portland, not far from the coast, focused on supporting the visually impaired and women from underserved communities. Amara took the lead in designing mentorship programs, often sitting in circle discussions with young girls who reminded her of herself, unsure, overlooked, and quietly powerful. Grant taught music again. Not just theory, but feeling. How to recognize tone through emotion. How to hear silence as part of the melody. The students didn't care about his last name or former status. They loved how deeply he listened. The Drake estate no longer felt like a cold cathedral. The curtains were drawn wide now. Light poured in. The once muted walls bore framed photographs. Amara laughing in the garden, Grant at the piano, children planting flowers in the greenhouse. One rainy afternoon, Amara stood in the doorway of the music room, holding a small white envelope. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from significance. Grant looked up from his piano bench, his brow lifting slightly. "What is it?" he asked gently. She stepped forward and placed the envelope in his hand. "It's from the hospital." He opened it slowly. Inside was a single photograph, a sonogram. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was sacred. Then Grant reached for her hand, holding it against his heart. "I didn't think I could love you more," he whispered. "But somehow, I do." Amara buried her face against his shoulder, letting the safety of his embrace soften every memory that had once haunted her. She wasn't pretending anymore. She wasn't filling anyone's place. She was simply Amara Quinn, a woman loved deeply, completely, as herself. That night, they stood on the back porch, watching the rain blur the world beyond the garden. Grant's hand rested protectively over her stomach, his thumb tracing gentle circles. "Do you think they'll look like you?" he asked softly. "I hope they have your eyes," Amara replied. He smiled. "Then I hope they see the world the way we learn to, through trust, not just sight." As the rain turned to mist and the sky broke open with stars, Grant pulled her close. "Remember what I said the day after my surgery?" he asked. She nodded. "You were afraid the world wouldn't be as beautiful as you imagined." He kissed her temple. "I was wrong. It's more beautiful, because you're in it." And so, the girl who once lived in someone else's shadow became the woman who lit her own path. And the man who once feared what he could not see found the deepest clarity in the only thing that truly mattered: love, raw, unfiltered, and real. The world may have judged their beginning, but it would never define their ending. Because some love stories aren't written in perfect lines. They're carved through storms, softened by forgiveness, and sealed not with spectacle, but with truth. And this Their story was one worth remembering forever. The story of Amara Whitmore and Grant Beaumont is not just a tale of love. It is a profound journey of self-identity, vulnerability, and the courage to face truth even when it hurts. What began as a forced deception, a woman marrying her sister's blind fiancé under a veil of lies, blossomed into a relationship rooted in authenticity and emotional resilience. Amara, the quiet and overlooked sister, was thrust into a role she never chose. Bound by guilt and family pressure, she walked down an aisle as someone else. She lived in shadows, believing her worth was conditional. But what no one foresaw, least of all herself, was that in pretending to be someone else, she would finally discover who she truly was. Grant, the guarded millionaire who had lost his sight but not his intuition, may have been blind, but he was never fooled. He sensed the shift in voice, the difference in touch, the warmth in silence. Yet he chose to wait, not for the truth, but for the soul behind it to reveal itself. He didn't fall in love with perfection. He fell in love with the woman who dared to show him kindness in darkness. Their love was not easy. It was born in the tension between betrayal and redemption. But it taught us something timeless. Real love is not about what you see. It's about what you feel when no one's watching. And in the quiet spaces where Amara offered care without expecting praise, and where Grant listened without needing sight, they built something real, something lasting, even when the truth surfaced, and Amara's world threatened to crumble. Grant chose to see her for who she truly was. Not a liar, but a woman brave enough to stay when she had every reason to run. Their story reminds us that no mask can hold forever, but if someone chooses to stay after the mask is gone, that's love. Not fantasy, not obligation, but choice. Life lesson. Sometimes we spend our lives trying to fit into someone else's mold, believing we're only lovable when we're perfect or playing a role. But the right people, those meant to walk life beside us, don't need a version of us. They need us. Imperfect, flawed, scared, and still trying. So let this be your reminder. Be honest. Love deeply. Let yourself be seen. Question time. What do you think made Grant fall in love with Amara? A. Her ability to pretend perfectly as Celeste. B. Her kindness and authenticity when no one else cared. Drop your answer A or B in the comments. What about you? Do you believe love can be born from unexpected, even painful beginnings? Or do you think deception, no matter how noble, can't lead to something real? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear different perspectives. And if this story touched your heart, inspired you, or made you believe in second chances, don't forget to like, share, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel so we can continue bringing you powerful, emotional stories that stay with you long after the screen fades. Thank you for walking this journey with us. Until the next story.